Did you know that Max Verstappen has never won in Singapore in 8 attempts? And the worst part, Red Bull arrives at the Marina Bay GP with a car that melts in the heat and could be its worst enemy. Before continuing, tell me in the comments, do you think Verstappen can break his curse in Singapore, or will it be another disaster for Red Bull? The question is clear. What's going on inside Red Bull that has driven Verstappen and the team into a state of complete panic? Stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In this video, we'll break down the technical and psychological crisis Red Bull is experiencing ahead of the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix. I'll tell you why the RB21 is such a problematic car, what role Verstappen's history at Marina Bay plays, and above all, what consequences this situation could have on its immediate future. Red Bull Racing arrives at the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix in the midst of one of the most complex situations in its recent history. What just a couple of seasons ago seemed like an absolute reign, with unquestionable dominance of its car and star driver, has now transformed into a desperate fight to maintain relevance. The team currently sits fourth in the Constructors' Championship with 272 points, far behind McLaren, which leads by more than 350 points. This gap not only mathematically eliminates them from the fight for the team's title, but also starkly reflects how a team that was at the top of motorsport has fallen into a critical situation. We're not just talking about sporting results, but also a technical and organizational setback that has become the linchpin of the crisis. Max Verstappen, meanwhile, isn't going through an easy time either. The Dutchman, a four-time world champion, sits third in the Drivers' Championship, 69 points behind leader Oscar Piastri. That gap, although theoretically possible to overcome, requires a practically perfect combination of results, both in terms of its own performance and the errors of others. And the truth is that recent trends are not in its favor. While McLaren seems to have found the formula to dominate both in qualifying and the race, Red Bull relies too heavily on specific conditions to shine. This gap has put Verstappen in an unprecedented situation, having to race against the current, without the technical security that accompanied him in his years of greatest dominance. On tracks like Monza and Baku, where thermal degradation is low, Red Bull showed glimpses of greatness and even achieved convincing victories. But when the calendar takes them to more demanding scenarios in terms of tire management or high aerodynamic loads, such as Budapest or Bahrain, the car exposes all its weaknesses. This creates a dangerous psychological dynamic. The team knows its car can be fast in specific circumstances, but it also knows that on circuits like Singapore, with its extreme heat and punishing street layout, shortcomings are likely to come back to haunt them. There is real and acknowledged concern within Red Bull about what might happen in Singapore. Management and engineers are well aware that Marina Bay is a circuit that exposes the RB21's weaknesses to the fullest. It demands extremely high downforce, generates extreme temperatures, and brutally demands tire management. Laurent Mekies has been open in prior statements. They have had constant problems on high downforce tracks since before Budapest, and there is no indication that these issues have been fully resolved. This candor, unusual in Red Bull's communication, demonstrates that the team itself accepts that it arrives in Singapore at a disadvantage compared to McLaren. Helmut Marko's stance also reflects this vulnerable atmosphere. Normally known for his defiant and direct tone, the team advisor surprised everyone by admitting that the Singapore heat doesn't please the car at all, and that the race will be a real test to gauge where they stand. That a figure like Marko has publicly expressed the team's doubts sends a clear message. Red Bull no longer feels invulnerable and understands that rivals have taken a step forward while they remain trapped in a car riddled with structural limitations. This acknowledgement of weakness weighs much more heavily coming from an organization that has always made confidence its hallmark. Amidst all this, Verstappen tries to maintain a measured tone, but his tone reflects a certain distrust. The Dutchman acknowledged that recent victories at Monza and Baku were a major boost, but also insisted that Singapore is a different test that will require more than a simple setup adjustment. When a driver with Verstappen's experience and cool demeanor displays caution in his words, it means he himself is aware that the chances of success are slim. And beyond what he says in front of the cameras, those within the team know that if Verstappen doesn't have 100% confidence in the car, it's unlikely he'll be able to perform at the extraordinary level that usually makes the difference. The contrast between driver and team is also evident in the way both approach the situation. Red Bull insists that every lesson learned from the RB21 can be transferred to the 2026 project, trying to find positive meaning in a year filled with difficulties. Verstappen, on the other hand, seems more focused on the immediate present and how to maximize every opportunity he has, even if the conditions aren't ideal. This difference in approach fuels the narrative that there is an underlying tension between what the driver needs and what the team can offer. Ultimately, the Dutchman wants a winning car now, while the board seems to be thinking more about the medium term. If Red Bull fails to achieve a convincing result in Singapore, the blow will be much deeper than a simple bad weekend. What's at stake is the credibility of the technical project surrounding the RB21 and, by extension, the trust that both the press and the fans themselves place in the team. The victories at Monza and Baku would then be seen as mere isolated flashes, the product of specific circumstances that favor the car's characteristics, rather than a sign of a true recovery. This nuance is crucial because it could establish the narrative that Red Bull is no longer capable of consistent development and that its moment of glory is behind it. The sporting impact would also be immediate. Max Verstappen, who still has a mathematical chance of fighting for the championship, would see those aspirations reduced to almost zero if he fails to achieve a good result in Marina Bay. With McLaren consolidated at the top and increasingly competitive, a stumble in Singapore would mean losing ground in a championship that is unforgiving of mistakes. And most seriously, it would reveal that the car isn't up to par with its rivals in demanding conditions, which would sap both the driver and the team's motivation in the final stretch of the season. But the consequences go beyond the numbers. Internally, a failure in Singapore could increase the pressure on Red Bull's technical leadership. Laurent Mekies, who has tried to maintain a realistic yet optimistic approach, would have to answer much tougher questions. The engineers, already working under pressure trying to correct structural problems, would be even more exposed to media scrutiny and the frustration of a driver like Verstappen, who won't settle for anything less than a winning car. In that climate, any latent tension can escalate into open conflict. In the short term, Red Bull's strategy appears to be focused on maximizing the RB21's strengths, even if these are limited and highly dependent on the conditions at each track. The team has decided to continue developing the car even at this late stage of the season, an unusual move when most teams are already focused on next year's car. This decision reflects that, beyond immediate results, Red Bull is seeking to fully understand the structural issues with its chassis and find solutions that can be carried over to the 2026 project. However, it is still a double-edged sword. While they invest resources in a car with a low roof, their rivals are making steady progress toward the future. Looking ahead to the upcoming races, very inconsistent performance is expected. On low-downforce circuits like Mexico or Las Vegas, the RB21 may continue to show glimpses of competitiveness, especially if tire degradation doesn't become a decisive factor. But on demanding tracks like Singapore or even Abu Dhabi, the picture changes dramatically. There, the car's dynamic weaknesses and its poor relationship with heat become an obstacle that seems almost impossible to overcome. In other words, Red Bull will have to play for survival in the tricky scenarios and go all out in those where the characteristics of their car give them a minimal advantage. What happens in Singapore will serve as a thermometer to gauge the team's true situation. If Verstappen achieves a positive result on a circuit that has never favored him, it could be a sign that there is still room to salvage the season and keep the dream of a title alive. The Dutchman knows that his talent allows him to extract more performance from a flawed car than any other driver on the grid, but he also understands that this ability has a limit. There's no point in being the best if the car can't perform at the level of its rivals in the key races. What seemed like a rumor of internal tension has now become an undeniable fact. There are doubts both inside and outside of Red Bull about whether they truly have the capacity to become a dominant team again. And those doubts aren't just technical, they're also strategic. Now the question is for you. Do you think Verstappen will finally break his curse in Singapore, or will the RB21 once again expose all its weaknesses at the worst possible moment? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.